Hello. um, my name is Linda Covey, Linda Sue Covey, and I'm Cherokee on my mother's father's side and on my father's mother's side. And we think we are Southern Cheyenne on my father's side. So my family originated from Fort Sumner, New Mexico. They settled New Mexico, Guadalupe County, before New Mexico became a state. My mother's father's family settled Cherokee County, Alabama, before Alabama became a state. Introducing yourself and your background, who you are, is an important part of American Indian culture or way of introduction. Not so much what your job is or your education or what you do, but who are you? Where do you come from? Who are your parents? So family names on my father's side are Edwards and Merriman and Wilson and even Youngblood. And on my mother's side is Sneed and Tadlock. And that's also some English side on that side as well. But this story really started because my mother and father got married. And my father and his parents were migrant workers that followed the crops down from Oklahoma into Texas and New Mexico. And my father and his parents were working on a peanut ranch where my uncle was dating the daughter of the owner, and my uncle brought my mother to that ranch. She met my father. They later moved to New Mexico to Fort Sumner, and my mother and father ended up eloping. And when they got married, the only way to say it is all hell broke loose in both families. And my mother's father was so upset about my mother marrying this Indian migrant worker. And at that time, we didn't know about his Indian heritage that much. And the marriage was quite convoluted. From my memories and stories from childhood is that my two older brothers, the brother that looked more Indian, the other side wouldn't have anything to do with, and the brother that looked less Indian, the Indian side didn't want to have anything to do with. There seemed to be favorites. There seemed to be a lot of conflict around this Indian heritage, and my parents actually were divorced when I was born. So I never saw my father. He only saw me once in the hospital as a baby, and for many, many years we lost that whole side of my family. And many years later, I found part of my father's and his family, and at the same time my mother found part of her father's family that had been missing for many years. So this story of Indian heritage has been years and years in the making. Now, Fort Sumner is pivotal to that because Fort Sumner, New Mexico, is also called Basquidando, which means the place is Hydwili. I'm not saying that right. That's a Diné word. It's the place of suffering. And Fort Sumner was created specifically as a prison fortress to hold the 7,000 and more Navajo and Apache and a few others that were sent there on the long walk. I lived 3 miles from that old fort area with my aunt. I grew up with my aunties a lot and my uncle a lot during my childhood. You know, my mother worked, my father was gone, and so I spent a lot of time with them, and we would often go down to the old fort to play. Down at the old fort in Fort Sumner, I know everybody knows this, is where Billy the Kid's grave is. So the claim to fame of Fort Sumner was Billy the Kid. And I can remember seeing crumbling foundations and old, you know, I knew, somehow I knew about that fort. And on the museum of the Billy the Kid museum is the pictures of Manuelito and pictures of Kit Carson, and that's just a part of my childhood history. I grew up with it. You know, I lived there, I played there, I walked on those grounds. As a young woman, and after becoming a Baha'i, I used to go out there and say prayers. And I can barely tell this without crying. So I always wondered who those people were that had died there, that had lived there. It was just like I could hear the very earth just crying. And I'd say many prayers, and all my life I wondered who were these people? Would I ever meet any of their descendants? And that's the best way I can describe it. Is that Fort area had a profound effect on me. When I was a social worker for Division of Family Services, children's service worker in Columbia, Missouri, and I had become quite involved in my native heritage. I was introduced into the powwow, the dance at the powwow, in the mid-1980s, early 1990s, and I started picking up my culture at that time. Now, remember, us children grew up with stories of our Indian grandmother. We knew that they were migrant workers. We knew she had a long braid down her back. We knew she was a very eccentric person. We knew she was very proud of her native heritage. We didn't hear so much about my mother's father's mother. Her name was Nancy, or was it Jane? Jane Wind, W-I-N-N. And my aunt told me her name had been Wind, W-I-N-D, and that it was anglicized to Win, which was a very common thing. So the Sneed brothers came over from the old country, and they, at least my great-grandfather, married a full-blood Cherokee from Cherokee County, Alabama. But it was my father's mother that was the real Indian at hand. She was the one that was eccentric and so on and so forth. And part of my background's in psychology, and I used to just think she was an eccentric, like maybe a schizophrenic or something, But when I really started studying my culture, she was just a little old Cherokee woman. She was very stubborn, very outspoken. Sometimes she would get mad and not speak to her son for a year or two at a time, my father. Very much like hill people in some ways. And the story as a child was that she was given Indian land in Oklahoma and she refused it. Well, I don't know much about that. We just grew up with that story. And later, studying my culture, that happened with a lot of people that were given land. And they either didn't know to accept it, or somehow they lost it, or it was taken away from them. If you read the book, I think the title is As Long as the Waters Run, or As Long as the Rivers Flow, As Long as the Grass is Green. It tells that whole story about the land run in Oklahoma and how the Cherokees lost their land, or how it was allotted and divided up. So we always wondered, my two brothers and I, we always wondered about those stories. And Mom would tell us, she would tell us about home remedies that her mother-in-law would make for her, and birth control, which didn't work, and for her at least, and just things like that. So when we moved to Missouri, Mom was sent, after she got a divorce, she went to Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and they sent her to Missouri as a missionary, and that's how we got to Missouri. And the loss of our home in New Mexico, we really, my two brothers and I, we really never got over. My middle brother in particular seemed to be the more tender of us three children. He was also the one that looked more Indian. He had dark olive skin, dark, lanky, sort of oily hair, big ears, big nose, and he was made fun of all the time. Just picked on and tormented. made fun of in the town we lived in, Missouri, and he just never recovered from that move. Us children always felt the tremendous loss of New Mexico, because in Missouri we were strangers, and we remained strangers and outsiders all of our life, growing up in school, going to school. But we would go back and spend summers in Fort Sumner with my Aunt Irene, or we would spend summers in Amarillo, Texas with my Uncle Joe, or we would go to Uncle Jim's. He was a rancher and he broke horses, and watching him come riding across the plains was just like watching an Indian on a horse ride right over the prairie, you know. So all of those memories and those experiences that were growing up shaped what happened later on. So one time when I was a social worker in Columbia, for Native American Heritage Awareness Month, which is November, a lady came to one of the state departments to speak. And her name, I apologize, I can't pronounce her last name correctly, but it's Lucy Tapahanso. She's a poet and a writer and a scholar, and she's from Farmington, New Mexico. And I had been to the Navajo Reservation 3 years prior to that event, to Black Mountain area, Black Mesa, and had spent some time with the Bedoni family, Tom Bedoni and his family. And part of my educational background is in anthropology, which I love, and I had found a work stone tool just lying on top of the ground. And I knew that no one else knew what that was, and I knew the children would be playing with it and just throwing it around. And so I asked permission, you know, to bring that with me. And, you know, it's around, you could tell it's worked, obviously, or at least I could tell. And so I brought the stone with me, and that stone became like a friend. You know, it traveled with me, it stayed in my van, it went on many journeys. But I began to feel about 3 months before Lucy came and gave her presentation that stone needed to go home. You needed to go home. So when I learned that she was Navajo and she is from New Mexico, after the talk was over, and she talked about the long walk and what had happened in New Mexico. And so I walked down the aisle to Lucy after the audience had left, and I said to her, "I'm from Fort Sumner, New Mexico." And she turned her back on me. And and I knew why she had done it, you know, the pain. And so I said to her, "And I'm also Cherokee," and she turned around. And I told her the story of the stone, and I said, ask her if she would take it back. And she understood. And so I went out to my vehicle and I got the stone and brought it back in and gave it to her, and it was just like parting with a dear friend, giving that stone up. But I'll never forget the feeling of saying I'm from Fort Sumner and her turning her back, you know, because to the Navajo and the Apache, Fort Sumner was a place of death, place of imprisonment, of sorrow, of great anguish, of loss of culture. And so all of those things kind of set the stage for what was to come. Some years later, after I had been highly active in my culture and had been past the pipe, for instance, I went back to Fort Sumner. We would go periodically to visit family there. My aunt's home was still 3 miles from the old fort. My cousin, Jetty Joe, now lived there. And that particular Thanksgiving, my brother and his family and I went for Thanksgiving. And my Aunt Irene, who was just a beloved aunt, had died. We would go down to the fort and we'd look at the cottonwood trees coming back. And these are the remnants of the cottonwood trees that those prisoners planted there at the old fort. And there's something like 35 or so left now. But I would wonder about those trees. They're big and old and ancient looking. And so when I would ask questions about the fort and ask questions, it's like, you know, the more predominantly non-Indian side of the family didn't want to answer, didn't know how to answer, didn't know what to say. So at that time, my own elders had given me a little task to do. And they wanted me to go find a stone by the Pecos River. Now the Pecos River runs through Fort Sumner, and it runs right past the old fort area. And as a child growing up, I was always proud that I was born on the Pecos, you know. That's the stuff of cowboy stories and westerns and legends. And so I'd never really been to the Pecos because in town it was always dry. I never saw water in that part of the Pecos. But the Pecos River down by the old fort area has water in it. But I didn't want anybody to know what I was doing. Didn't want my brother to know or anybody to know. So I'd taken some tobacco and some smudge and my pipe, and I was going to go down. And this particular evening, it was about 5 o'clock, close to 5, and cold in November, and I noticed this small adobe building that I'd never noticed before. So I thought, well, I'll explore. So I turned down that road and went down to that adobe building, and it was a small interpretive center. And it had been there since like the 1970s something. I'd never noticed it before. I went in. The park person, the attendant, was native, and he understood my desire to go down by the Pecos. And the center was full of like Civil War uniforms or army stuff. It didn't really say a whole lot about the history of the old fort, more about the history of, it did say a lot about the history of the Navajo. It said a lot about the history of the fort, why the fort was created and all that. So I went down this trail by the Pecos and around, and sure enough, I found exactly the stone the elders had sent me to get. And came back up around the trail, and there was a rock cairn there that I'd never seen before, and a plaque, and it had been a good number of years, I guess, since I'd been there, because this was all new to me. And on the cairn of rock was red prayer ties and offerings and things that people had left there. Well, I didn't take the time to do the pipe ceremony, but I said prayers there, said the Baha'i prayer, particularly blessed is the spot, and put out tobacco. And I left thinking, now they know. At least I know something, and at least somebody else, whoever comes here, knows more than they did. I left with a sense of satisfaction that the old fort as the prison, more or less, had been recognized. And that would have been in that would have been around 2003, somewhere in that neighborhood, 2003, 2004 maybe. So the next thing that happened was I moved from Columbia, Missouri down to Lake of the Ozarks in a little place called Max Creek, primarily to help establish a youth camp with some friends, but I also realized I was close enough to Missouri State University to go back and get my master's degree in religious studies. I was within commuting distance to do that. And without going into a lot of detail how that happened, I found myself quite suddenly and unexpectedly back in graduate school, and I was on the Religion, Self, and Society track. And I thought I went to make myself move, to get myself out of my rut, get myself thinking again. And because I love religious studies, I love anthropology, I love psychology, and all those things explain human nature. This is what I'm really interested in. So along about the second year, into the first year, you know, we pretty much have to decide if we're going to write a seminar paper or if we're going to write a thesis. And I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. And also I wasn't sure why I was there or what I wanted to do it on or anything. And some of my professors and my fellow students knew that I had Native heritage, and they suggested that I go and talk to Dr. Martha Finch, because her specialty was New England Indians, colonial period. And I did that. Finally, toward about a year and a half into maybe third semester, I went and I talked to her. And she said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, well, besides my children, the Baha'i faith, and my Native American heritage. And she said, those are not compatible. And I said, oh, yes, they are. And I began to tell her about all the Baha'is, the Native Americans, the American Indians that had declared on the Pine Ridge Reservation and on other reservations throughout the United States. And she was just astonished because no one in academia seemed to know that there were American Indian Baha'is. It was a real shock to her. And she's a very knowledgeable person, you know. So we both got excited, and she said, well, you can do your thesis on that. I mean, it wasn't my idea. You know, if it had been my idea, somehow that would have taken it a different way. It wasn't my idea. It was her idea. And she said, you know, can you spend a month or summer on the Pine Ridge Reservation? And I was like, well, yeah, I think I could, because I knew some people there. I knew Cindy Ketches and Peter Ketches, and I felt fairly comfortable in thinking that maybe I could do that. And I knew some of the history of the Baha'i faith on the Pine Ridge Reservation. So that's the direction we started in. But it certainly didn't end up there. I had a consultation with Jacqueline Left Hand Bull, who I don't remember at that time if she was she was on the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States, Baha'is of the United States, but I don't remember if she was the chairperson or not at that time. But I went to an American Indian weekend at Lou Helen, the Baha'i school in Michigan, and she was the leader, facilitator for that weekend, and I was finally able to visit with her in private, and she basically said, you know, the Lakota have been studied enough. The Lakota are kind of tired of being studied, and maybe in her really direct way, that wasn't quite the best thing to do. At the same time that was happening, other little intimations were coming to me about Navajo. And during that weekend, she had said something along the lines that NABI, the Native American Institute on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, was the first A cluster in the United States. Well, I knew I'd been to NABI, short for Native American Baha'i Institute. I'd been to NABI. I know that there's no other Native American Baha'i Institute in the United States like that, and I don't think there is in Canada. I think it's the only one in North America. And it just really hadn't occurred to me, you know, to go in that direction. So when I got back, I got a call from my elders, Native American, the group of holy elders that guided me since 1996. And they said, out of the blue, they said, why don't you do your thesis on the Navajo Reservation? There was 4 things that happened. And I can't remember what all 4 they were, but all 4 confirmed that I should switch the thesis to the Navajo Reservation. Well, I knew of this gathering, see. I knew there had been this great council fire in 1962 at Pine Springs. And I knew that a number of Navajo, or Diné, is the correct term, had become Baha'is. And I tell you, from a religious point of view, that is a phenomenon. You know, it's a phenomenon. And so I went to my teacher, I went to Dr. Finch, and I said, you know, what do you think about this? And she was very much in agreement. So we changed it. Her and I together changed the focus of my thesis from Pine Ridge, from the Lakota Baha'is to the Navajo Baha'is. And that's how it got started. And to me, it's all full circle, because it's brought so much healing to me from my own childhood. See, this isn't something that just, oh, you're going to pick a subject here and you do your research on this subject. No, this is all bound up in my own history, my own growing up, my own family, my own memories. So I began. But I have to back up for just a moment, because there's another story. Dear friends, Alfred and Tina Kahn had asked me to come out. I think it was the summer of 2004, maybe. 2003, 2004, somewhere in there. And to assist them with the building of a lodge, and they wanted me to be at their family reunion, and also their son's marriage blessing way ceremony. And so another friend and I, Megan Orr, Megan was the chauffeur and the driver, and off we went on this journey. And as always, I wanted to go through Amarillo and see my uncle's wife that was still living there, Aunt Bernice, and through New Mexico to Fort Sumner. And I knew there had been a new interpretive center built, see. I was just longing to see that new interpretive center. So we got there, Megan and I got there again about sundown. It was about 4:30 or 5. And behind the Billy the Kid Museum now is this tall, conical, teepee-shaped building that just dwarfs the Billy the Kid Museum. And over on this side is the original interpretive center that's still there, but you know, they're doing something else with it now. And walking up to this new interpretive center is one of those cottonwood trees lying down, and there at that time was a half-finished arbor. And oh, my heart, my heart, my heart, I'm telling you, it was just something else, you know. But I was not prepared for what happened next. So I walked in the center, and I looked around, and I saw all the history that was missing in that first interpretive center. All the Navajo history. And I'm telling you, I just couldn't help myself. I broke down, and I sobbed, and I sobbed, and I sobbed. You know, it's like full circle coming home. All these many, many years later, to see that was just beyond words. And one of the staff there was a young Apache woman, and she just did her best to try and console me, and you know, and she said, well, she didn't know very much about her history and on. And I'm like, well, you need to find out and, you know, pick up your culture. But I just was totally overwhelmed. And so we left there, Megan and I, and we drove through Fort Sumner, and then we took the highway, I forget the name of it, that goes over, because we were going over to Carlsbad to see my spiritual parents, George and Ruby Jones. We were going there. And so if you've ever been to New Mexico and you see these rolling hills and you can see the horizon forever, and the setting sun and the clouds, and off in that distance was the strangest bank of clouds we'd ever seen. And we stopped the car and watched it. And these dark clouds looked like a horse rearing up And then it turned into a bear. Oh, and we realized we were seeing a tornado touch down. That's what we were seeing. So we watched this phenomenon, this rearing horse, and then this bear, and then it just, dissipated and blew away. It was quite profound. So we went on to Carlsbad, and from there we went on over to the Khans at near Nabium, Pine Springs. And I didn't realize that the Khans had been to the grand opening of the new interpretive center, which I think the grand opening was like in June. We were there in July. And so when we got there, we're talking about it and we're visiting, and Alfred and Tina are telling me that they had been to the grand opening. And then Alfred said that Manuelito, he was related to Manuelito. I think it's great-great-grandfather in the Navajo way, in the Diné way. And at that moment, it just struck me that this was such truly full circle. Here, I had wondered all those years who those people were. Who had lived, who had come there, who had died there, who had suffered there. Would I ever meet any of their descendants? And standing in front of me was Alfred, descendant of Manuelito, whose face I have seen thousands of times on the side of the Billy the Kid Museum. Maybe hundreds upon hundreds of times over the course of my lifetime, and he looks like him. They resemble each other very much. The whole thing was just totally profound and humbling and surreal, mystical. We all cried, we just couldn't believe it. It was like pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. And so then later, when I started the thesis on why the Diné became Baha'i, basically. The title of the thesis is Diné Becoming Bahá'í, something through the eyes of prophecy. I chose to do a thesis in religious studies based on the 1962 Great Council Flower Gathering held at the Pine Springs, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, in which over 300 Navajos declared their faith in Baha'u'llah. What happened that made the Navajo accept Baha'u'llah? So I'm going to tell you. I did research for about 3 years. I went back, I interviewed elders, I interviewed the Khans, Chester and Franklin and Sonny Jr., and I interviewed Linda Wilson, Jackie and Johnny, Jackie Wilson and John Nelson and Ruby, and did tons of research, much more than is needed for a thesis. And I had also heard years before, I knew of this writing from Annie Kahn about the chief with 12 feathers, And I knew of Vincent Brown. He was just like a spiritual giant to me, one of my spiritual mentors from the other worlds of God, from the Navajo Kingdom. So I'd read the books by Vincent Brown, and I knew about this prophecy, and I'd read all the Indian prophecies I could get my hands on connected with Baha'i. And I'd saved all these over the course of years from like the 1970s on. And so I had all that archival material at my disposal. And I felt like one of the reasons that the Diné had accepted Baha'u'llah was because of this prophecy of the return of the chief with 12 feathers. I, at that time, did not know about the prophecy of the warrior twins, return of the warrior twins. But essentially, the Diné have two prophecies that, in my opinion, and which I try to prove in my thesis, are fulfilled by the coming of the Baha'i faith. The warrior twins, the return of the warrior twins, are the Bab and Baha'u'llah. And the chief with 12 feathers is Baha'u'llah, and the 12 feathers are the 12 basic principles. And there's a lot more to it than that. But in interviewing the Diné Baha'is, they're very clear in their understanding that their prophecies have been fulfilled. So, you know, we as non-native, we as non-Diné, it's not our job to argue with whether their prophecies are fulfilled or not. If they believe they're fulfilled, and if they believe that the Baha'i faith fulfilled them, then as a researcher, you know, that's what I go on. So I tried to show the connections, and I analyzed it psychologically. I analyzed it from a religious studies point of view, from anthropology and from sociology, and from the Baha'i writings to see how this all happened and all come together. And what I can tell you right now, that in my heart of hearts, I know, and my precious dear Dr. Martha Finch, her and I just sort of went round and round about this, because American Indians don't join other religions. There are no known instances of full-blood reservation American Indians become Judists, or Buddhists, or Hindus, or Muslims. They're Christians. They're Christians, and many of them are Christians by choice, but they're Christians because Christianity was the religion brought to these shores by the conquerors. Okay? So we all know the stories of American Indians, children being sent to boarding schools, which also covered my thesis, and other federal acts. There's a great deal to it. But American Indians, by and large, do not join a little known, unheard of Eastern religion. It's just not done. And there had to be reasons for it. And you find the reasons in their own prophecies. That's my thesis, and that's my argument. So I found myself unexpectedly going back to graduate school again, and choosing to write a thesis based on all these wonderful events that had happened to bring my life full circle. The thesis on why Navajos or Diné would become Baha'i. And that's what the thesis is all about. And it also pretty much answered for me why I was back in graduate school, and I feel like hopefully in some way this gives back to the Diné and helps other people to learn their prophecies and to respect their prophecies, because it's storytelling. It's through storytelling that culture and prophecies live. And so basically the thesis is a story about how the faith came to the Navajo Reservation. I do history on the early homefront pioneers to the reservation, and it's a full story of history and why and how and argument, and shows the beautiful spirit of the Diné, I believe. And so when Martha Finch, when Dr. Finch said to me those two are not compatible, and I said, oh yes they are, because it was just unheard of that American Indians would become Baha'is, you know, because the Baha'i faith started in 1844 in far off Iran, halfway around the world, and American Indians tend to stay traditional. They're either traditional to their own culture, or they may be members of the Native American Church, or they join one of the sects or denominations of Christianity. But that's about it. And even becoming Christians, and even, of course, being in the Native American Church, American Indians still keep their culture, still practice their traditions. We still keep our cultures, still practice our traditions. And as a Native American Baha'i myself, I find absolutely no conflict between my own native heritage and culture and ceremonies and the Baha'i faith. As a matter of fact, the Baha'i faith enriches and enhances and clarifies and fulfills my own native teachings. How I became a Baha'i. Well, I've always been a rebel, let me say that. And just as a young child, I remember age 5 years old, it made no sense to me whatsoever that people in far-off places like in Africa might go to hell if they didn't know about Jesus. And as a child growing up in a very small rural town in Missouri, Conway, my goodness, we weren't allowed to play with the Catholic kids or go to movies with the Baptist kids. My mother was sent to Missouri as a missionary to the Back Hill folks from Moody Bible Institute. That's how we got to Missouri. And we started out in the Pentecostal church. You can't get much more fundamental than that. And the Pentecostal church evolved that we were in evolved into the Assembly of God church. So church was everything to us as children growing up. We would go to church often 3 days a week, maybe 4. And if there was revivals, then we went to all the revivals. And my uncle, Joe Sneed, he was a traveling evangelist all of his life. My beloved grandmother, my mother's mother, was a firm Methodist. My beloved Aunt Irene was a Church of Christ. And we were just kind of all over the place. But it just didn't compute to me. A lot of times, some things just didn't make sense. So when I was in the 8th grade, the science teacher had us kids argue if man would go to the moon or not. And the kids that believed man would go to the moon were over here, and the kids that believed man wouldn't go to the moon were over here. Well, my church said no. My church said, you know, if God wanted man on the moon, he would have put him there, basically. So out of respect for my church, I went to this side. And I had the most profound experience because I found myself arguing against myself, against everything that every fiber and cell in my body told me man would go to the moon, and I believed it with all my heart and soul in the 8th grade. And it was almost at that moment that I really began to question, and my faith more or less began to slip. And other things just didn't make sense to me. When I was a child growing up, it was a sin to wear makeup. By the time I was a teenager, it wasn't a sin anymore. We weren't allowed to wear blue jeans, but by the time I was grown, blue jeans were okay. You know, I mean, just this like, if something's a sin now, it should be a sin always. How can it be a sin now and not, you know, it didn't make sense. And so for me, religion has to make sense. Because basically, I'm a highly scientifically minded individual. And when I was in my 20s, I was so distraught with the world. I was ready to give God up. I was more than ready to give Jesus up, Christ up. But I still had a little bit of question about God. But I had decided that if I could not find a peaceful place on this planet, I wasn't going to believe in God anymore. Part of that was during the time of the Vietnam War, and I remember a particular scene on television, and there was a scene on the evening news of this river, and this river was clogged with bodies floating down the river. And I remember thinking to myself, how did they do that? How did they get that special effect? And then the next thought was, this is real. This is real. And it just seemed to me like the world was in such a mess, it was going to hell in a handbasket on a downhill pool, as we used to say in our family. And I'd had it. I didn't want any more to do with it. I was married, got married young, age 16, had my first child when I was 17, had 2 children by age 19, and all 4 children by age 29. And after the 2 oldest girls were born, and I started searching for a spiritual church, trying to find somewhere I could feel some spirituality. And I actually settled on an evangelical Methodist church in Marshville, Missouri, where we lived at the time. And I had a dream. And this dream was about the world ending in the Assembly of God way of the world ending. And that's with trains crashing, planes crashing, graves opening, earthquakes, horrible, horrible scenes of the end of the world ending. And I felt like I was going to die. I felt like I was just sliding off into this abyss and I was going to die. And this voice said, the time is not yet. I can still see that dream as vividly today as the day I had it. I was probably 20 years old when I had that dream. Well, we had a couple of very dear friends that was 10 to 11 years older than us, George and Ruby Jones, and they were Mormons, belonged to Latter-day Saint Church. But they were avid readers and avid researchers, and George had read an article in a Native American magazine about the Baha'i faith, and he wrote off about it and was sent to Charlotte Van Hoose's home in Springfield, Missouri. And he and Ruby was a school teacher, and they started attending firesides in Charlotte's house. And about a year later, they declared. But they didn't tell my husband Mike and I, they didn't tell us anything about it. And one day Ruby came to me and she said, well, we've joined the Baha'i faith. And I said to myself, well, I don't care what kind of crazy religion you belong to, we're still going to be friends. You know, but when they were Mormons and I was whatever you want to call me, my husband never grew up in church, so he really had no religious background. We never discussed religion. Now, we'd discuss science fiction and UFOs and everything else, but you know, Mormons don't believe like that, and we never discussed it. And she had later said that she had a lot of trouble looking over her classroom and thinking all those children were going to hell because they weren't Mormons, you know. So I didn't know that, but they became Baha'is. And then they tried to teach us the faith, and I was highly resistant. And George would give me books to read, and they were so hard to read that I never got through any of them. But their lives changed. Their health changed. They floated 3 feet off the ground all the time. You know, they were so happy. And at that time, and it was then Southwest Missouri State University, there was a very active group of Persian youth. And we were the same age as those Persian youth at that time, you know, because we got married so young. Well, they would come and get us up in the middle of the night, take us for coffee, and teach us the faith. It wasn't anything for them to take us up at 1 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, and so my husband was just so jealous he couldn't hardly see straight. He wasn't thinking about religion, particularly, you know, it's like, what's going on here? What are they doing? But I just loved it. And I kept asking Ruby questions. And finally, they took me to a fireside at Charlotte's house. And I asked one question there, and it was about anger. And I don't remember exactly what the answer was, but it soothed my heart. And on the way home, George said, well, what do you think? And I said, well, Jesus is the one and the only one, and that's the way it is, even though I was ready to toss Jesus along with God, remember. So of course it was pretty hard for me because, you know, you have to empty out the glass before you can fill it up. And I'd had all my lifetime of religious growing up and teaching. And Mike got very upset when I finally decided I wanted to become a Baha'i. What happened is that Ruby finally got tired of all my questions, and she gave me Thief in the Night. Well, it took me forever to read that book. Now, I'm a speed reader and an avid reader, but I can only read like that much at a time. And then I have to go away and think about it, come back that much, go away and think about it. And for the first time in my life, I read things written down that was exactly the way I believed. You know, it wasn't that I had to change my way of thinking to fit the faith. I already felt like that. And I had enough confidence in myself that I thought I'll find out who Baha'u'llah is. I'm not going to answer that question. He's either got to be right or wrong. There's no in between. He's either the biggest imposter the world has ever known, or he's right. And I'll find it. I'll figure it out somewhere along the way. So I didn't even worry about that question. And as I started going through Thief in the Night, this white light came. This white light was like around me for months. And all of this brilliant white light. And I knew by the time I finished Thief in the Night that I was a believer. And I knew if I didn't follow that light, I could do anything. I could be a murderer, an adulteress. It didn't matter. I could be the best person in the world. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered if I didn't follow that light. So actually, my husband was going to divorce me and take the kids. He was so sure it was a cult and it was wrong, and he was so confused, and we spent hours upon hours studying the writings and studying the Bible. And finally, we went to a Baha'i cookout at George and Ruby's, and these young Persian students came and fixed dinner and Persian rice and Persian salad and all those wonderful Persian dishes. And George gave Mike the Divine Art of Living. And Mike stayed up all night that night reading the Divine Art of Living. And in the morning, he said, I'm ready to declare. Now, what took me months and months took him, when he got started, one night, you know, because he didn't have to empty out all that religious teaching. So we declared on my 24th birthday. Both of us together declared on my 24th birthday, February 28th, 1970. And that started all the adventures for all the rest of my life. All the rest of the years of my life. And I wouldn't trade the Baha'i faith for all the world and everything that's in it. Highlights.
5 minutes.
Well, George and Ruby and I had planned a trip to Old Mexico, and Ruby had said, well, wouldn't it be nice if 3 of us went as Baha'is? And I said, well, wouldn't it be nice if 4 of us went? Oh, neither one of us ever dreamed that my husband would declare, but we'd already started planning this trip, and he had built an RV out of a wrecked Airstream trailer. And so we declared in February, and we left on this trip in June. Now, mind you, those were the happiest times of our life, our marriage, and I got pregnant right away. Didn't think I could ever have another child, and I got pregnant with our son, Harold. So we went on this trip with me pregnant, and it was quite the journey. We went down through Old Mexico, up one side, across the other, to the Yucatan, Merida, through all the old ruins. We went to an Indian village that was nearly all Baha'i. We went to the Baha'i Center in Merida. We met the Baha'i mother, spiritual mother in New Mexico, of Old Mexico, and didn't even realize that's who it was. It was such a marvelous adventure for our first year of being Baha'is, and all 4 of us going as Baha'is was quite marvelous. We spent about 3 to 4 weeks just traveling in this RV. We really were quite on fire. There's been many other wonderful things happen. Was blessed to be organizer of the Nunavut Project, Journey to the Arctic's People, and got to go to the Arctic Circle and call to the Universal House of Justice in response to that, to the Inuit. That was a wonderful, wonderful journey. To walk the native path, to walk the Red Road and the Baha'i Road at the same time has given such bounties that are indescribable. I'm actually going to write a book about it. The title of the book is Lessons on the Rib of the Feather, about some of these spiritual journeys, mystical things that have happened along this way. So many. I don't know how the rest of the world lives without Baha'u'llah. I have no idea. how they even get through one day. That's my philosophy on it. That's it.